All right, everybody. Welcome back to this week. Last week we finished up World War One. I know it was quick, not my ideal way to treat World War One, but there's a whole lot of information on World War One out there. So much so that if I were going to treat World War One the way it should be treated, it by itself would be a year-long course. And we're all kind of aware of World War One, and maybe a little less aware than we are of World War Two. World War Two seems to, overshadow everything here, and we all know a lot about World War Two, very little about World War One. But we know even less, usually as a general public, about the years between World War One and World War Two. And that's going to be my focus this week, is what happened in those interwar years. So one of the big things that happens, and I've already kind of alluded to, is maybe a part of World War One, because it did happen during World War One, but also after World War One, is the Russian Revolution. Probably one of the biggest economic revolutions, as well as political revolutions in the history of the world. The Russian Revolution was actually a series of revolutions taking place in Russia throughout 1917. They ultimately resulted in the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II and the establishment of a communist state. Now, we need to understand that the Russian Revolution did not come about overnight. It was preceded by years and years of social unrest. So let's go back to the year 1905 to kind of understand what's going on there and learn about some events that set the stage for the Russian Revolution of 1917. So in 1905, Tsar Nicholas II was the Emperor of Russia. And he came to power in 1894, and he was not particularly popular with the Russian people. In 1905, he did not have the charisma characteristic of other leaders. Many people felt he was haughty and aloof. Many peasants and middle-class citizens felt the Tsar was out of touch with the realities of their meager existence. And for these reasons, his political power was less than secure. Now, according to the Tsar's unpopularity, or adding to the Tsar's unpopularity, was the fact that Imperial Russia was losing the Russo-Japanese War. And this, compounded with agricultural stagnation, class warfare, and general unrest, caused many Russians to become dissatisfied with the monarchist government. In early 1905, protests broke out in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, and elsewhere. Peasants and industrial workers went on strike and put on demonstrations throughout the city, including at the Tsar's Winter Palace. On January 22nd, 1905, a day that became known as Bloody Sunday, the Tsar's Imperial Guards opened fire on a crowd of thousands of peaceful protesters. And no one knows for certain how many people were killed, but figures range from 100 into the thousands. The heavy-handed action of the Tsar's Imperial Guards sparked further rioting and added fuel to the fire of revolution. Now, concerned his rule might be toppled, Nicholas II sought to appease revolutionaries by granting some reforms. Caving to political pressure, he approved the creation of the Duma, a legislative assembly, and the first Duma convened in 1906. The Tsar also agreed to a constitution granting basic civil liberties and transforming his absolute monarchy into more of a limited constitutional monarchy. Now, we need to remember the Tsar absolutely did not want to institute these changes, but he had the memory of Louis XVI and the French Revolution in his mind, and given the tide of resentment toward him, he basically had no choice. If he didn't want to suffer the same fate as Louis, his hands were tied. Now, at first, it looked like Nicholas II had weathered the storm of revolution. Demonstrations winded down as his reforms were supported by the people. Then came World War I in 1914. Now, with war came unimaginable loss of life, food shortages, and countless other forms of human misery. And as the war dragged on, the people increasingly became dissatisfied with it, feeling it simply wasn't worth the cost. Again, the Tsar's leadership came into question. In March of 1917, which was actually February according to the old Julian-style calendar system, large-scale demonstrations swept the capital of Petrograd. Peasants, workers, and even soldiers came out in armed protest. The capital soon devolved into anarchy, forcing Nicholas II to abdicate the throne. The February Revolution, as it is called, was important because it resulted in the overthrow of the Tsar and the installation of a new leftist provisional government. Now, Russia's new provisional government was highly divided between moderates and radicals. Members of the radical faction were called Bolsheviks, and they were composed primarily of working class citizens and were followers of Vladimir Lenin's communist ideology. In early November of 1917, which again was October according to the Julian calendar system, so when I call it the October Revolution, I say it happened in November, you know why, the radical Bolsheviks seized power in what has come to be called the October Revolution. It's also been called the Bolshevik Revolution. Arming themselves, the Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government and declared a communist state, and this state became the foundation for the Soviet Union. And after a successful revolution, Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin moved quickly to end Russia's participation in World War I. For the Bolsheviks and many in Russia, the war was simply not worth fighting. By the end of 1917, much of the Russian army had laid down their arms, although some groups continued to fight. And after months of negotiations, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk officially ended Russia's involvement in World War I. And the treaty between the new Bolshevik government and the Central Powers was signed March 3rd, 1918. The Russian revolutions had a profound impact on 20th century world history, as I stated at the beginning here. It ended Russia's involvement in World War I and at the same time led to the Russian Civil War, in which Bolshevik red forces fought conservative white forces between 1917 and 1922. Now, the Russian Revolution also led to the creation of the world's first communist state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, commonly called the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union became one of the world's leading 20th century powers until its fall in 1991. Now, I would love to do a Unit 7, but even if I did a Unit 7, I could still not cover in detail the Cold War and into the modern world with any sense of justification, much like I'm flying through, the world wars here. So I am going to spend just a few minutes, since I really won't get into the Soviet Union, to talk about the Soviet Union during the period, particularly after World War I to the Cold War. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union, USSR, has played a monumental part in 20th century world history. Since its creation in 1922, the Soviet Union has been at the center of world affairs. It was the world's first communist state, and the Soviet Union rose to power in the 20s and 30s. And during World War II, it was an allied power and helped defeat Nazi Germany. But immediately after the war, the Soviet Union and the United States entered a period of prolonged tension called the Cold War. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed for economic reasons. It could not keep up with the economic buildup, which fueled the military buildup of the United States, and eventually, as it tried to do that, imploded upon itself. So getting back, though, to 1917. Immediately following the October Revolution, Vladimir Lenin declared Russia to be a socialist state. Now, officially, it was called the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, but not everyone in Russia, however, was on board with the Bolshevik radicalism. The Russian Revolution immediately spawned the Russian Civil War, in which Bolshevik Reds fought conservative whites. And although the anti-Bolshevik whites were supported by the United States and other Western European democracies, matter of fact, very little people know this, the United States actually had a military force stationed in Moscow to help guard supplies and everything for the war effort. They were ultimately unable to stop the tide of communism in Russia. The Russian Civil War ended in 1922 with the Bolsheviks firmly in power. Now, upon achieving victory, the Bolsheviks absorbed regions other than Russia proper. Okay, this is where it can get tricky, so stick with me. The Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic was just one of the many republics that comprised the Soviet Union. Think of them as states within the United States. That republic came into existence in 1917, right after the October Revolution. The larger Soviet Union, however, did not officially come into existence until December 1922, when the declaration of the creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was signed, formally absorbing the Ukraine and other regions like Georgia and Armenia into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Think of it this way. Russia was the most powerful and largest republic within the Soviet Union, but not the sum total of the Soviet Union. Okay, I think we got that. Let's move on. So now that we understand how the Soviet Union came into existence, let's very quickly highlight a few key events in Soviet history. So when the Soviet Union was founded in 1922, Vladimir Lenin was its head of state. When he died in 1924, Joseph Stalin consolidated power through political intrigue to become Lenin's successor. Stalin essentially became the dictator of the Soviet Union, and under his rule, the Soviet Union emerged victorious in World War II, having helped defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Stalin was an important leader because under his rule, the Soviet Union has emerged as one of the two world superpowers, the United States, of course, being the other. Under his leadership, the Soviet Union also successfully exploded its first atomic bomb in August of 1949. Immediately following World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union began to see things very differently. And the former allies disagreed over how European nations should be reconfigured, for example. The Soviet Union wanted Eastern Europe to be composed of communist countries, whereas the United States wanted these countries to be democratic. And the Cold War stemmed from these issues and many others. The Cold War was a prolonged period of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it lasted roughly half a century from the end of World War II to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, we need to understand that a Cold War is a war in which actual physical combat does not occur. Instead, the Cold War is a war of threats, ideas, and competition. That said, regional hot wars like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Soviet War in Afghanistan did indeed stem from the broader Cold War. But we don't really call these these hot, they were really what we call police actions. They were actions taken by the executive of the United States. They weren't declared wars by Congress. So they're still seen in a way as not truly being war and therefore still part of the Cold War. Now, when Joseph Stalin died in 1952, he was succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev's best remembered for being the Soviet leader during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You may have seen video of him at the UN taking his shoe off and pounding it on the table. So Cold War tension was particularly high throughout his rule, with ideological clashes with US presidents like John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis and his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, after Kennedy's assassination. In the 1970s, under the new leader after Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, tensions relaxed somewhat, a period often called détente. And Brezhnev is the Soviet leader I remember earliest growing up with. He had eyebrows like this, for one thing, and he was hilarious to look at. However, détente ended with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, sometimes referred to as the Soviet Union's Vietnam War, in 1979, and tensions between the United States and the USSR resumed throughout the early and mid-1980s. By the 1980s, Soviet power was crumbling. They'd had a series of leaders after Brezhnev's death. Yuri Andropov, as a little kid, I always got a kick out of his last name, Andropov, and a couple others before we got to Mikhail Gorbachev. So in 1989, a number of Soviet-controlled Eastern European countries, such as Poland, held revolutions in which they threw off the shackles of communist rule. And these revolutions began in Poland and spread throughout the region. One of the most visible signs of the fall of communism was the fall of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989. And again, now we're into history where I was alive. I'm 18 years old. Matter of fact, I just gotten ready and signed the contract to join the Army. And all of a sudden, a friend of mine over at a friend's house, you got to see this. And we turn it on. They're knocking down the Berlin Wall. There was no indication of it. I mean, no Western news media. So tensions rise in Eastern Germany. All of a sudden, it just happened. It was the most unbelievable thing. This 50 years of Cold War, now all of a sudden, it was over. I mean, I still live in disbelief of that there was no buildup or anything. It was just one day, it was over. So under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, who tried to stem that tide against communism and make sure at least the Soviet Union didn't fall, he began a lot of moderate policies, what they called perestroika and glasnost, which resulted in lots of liberal reform, letting the people participate more. So perestroika refers to the restructuring of government, while glasnost refers to government transparency and openness. And one of the things, the major catalysts that caused this was the nuclear plant meltdown at Chernobyl. And there's a great series on HBO if you want to see, what that did to the Soviet people, what it was like for the Soviet people under a communist regime at the time. So as people got tastes of liberalization, though, that just whetted their appetite and they wanted more. Economic difficulties further weakened Soviet power. In December of 1991, the Soviet Union, as a result, officially dissolved. Ukraine and other Soviet republics became independent nations, while Russia officially became the Russian Federation that it is today. So that's kind of a brief history of the Soviet Union, getting into, if we'd had time for a Unit 7. So though Germany was hit hard by the measures of peace dictated by the Allies in the Treaty of Versailles, Arguably the most important measure for the political map of Europe was the subsequent dismantling of the Central European empires. The Treaty of Versailles alone took away large amounts of territory from Germany, and these territorial losses isolated Eastern Prussia, the very state which began assembling the German Empire in the 19th century. Additionally, Germany was forced to cede Alsace and Lorraine to France, and France also occupied German territory in the Rhineland. Large parts of what had been Eastern Germany were incorporated into the new Polish nation, a state that had been dead for over a century, but was now revived by the terms of the treaties in large part were dictated by nationalist concerns. In other words, for every nation a state, for every state a nation. A nation is a group of people with similar historical, linguistic, and cultural ties. And so the Polish people obviously are a nation, and they deserve to have their own government with its own territorial bounds. That is the state. Now, separate treaties with Austria-Hungary dismantled that sprawling Eastern European state as well. The Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye and the Treaty of Trianon recognized the independence of several states who had already declared independence as the war was ending, and further severed the dynastic union between Austria and Hungary, acknowledging Hungary as a democratic republic without a monarch. The northern parts of the empire, primarily inhabited by Czechs and Slavs, were made into the new nation of Czechoslovakia, or were given to Poland. In the Balkans, much of Austria-Hungary's territory became part of the state of Yugoslavia. Now, the creation of many of these new states was done in large part due to US President Woodrow Wilson, who pushed at the various peace talks for ethnic and national self-determination. And again, remember, national refers to people with common ties and everything like that. And that meant the boundaries of Europe should be redrawn to accommodate ethnic groups and allow them to choose their own forms of government. And it's a great spectacle. You're sitting in Paris at the Treaty of Versailles, and they're inviting all these ethnic groups to come testify before this committee of world leaders, the big three, about why they deserve their own nation state. And ironically, a group of Native Americans show up there to testify too. And Wilson, who is so big on pushing for all these ethnicities to have their own state, just completely ignores the Native Americans. So naturally, this led to many of these post-war entities to adopt forms of democracy, including even in Germany, where the Weimar Republic was founded in 1919. The final defeated nation that received harsh treatment by the Allies was the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire had been slowly declining in power and relevancy for more than a century, and defeat in World War I signaled the death of the old sick man of Europe. The settlement in formerly Ottoman territory was far different than in Eastern Europe. Rather than national self-determination ruling the day, the Ottoman Empire was carved up with an imperialist mindset. Large parts of the Middle East were given as international mandates from the new League of Nations that was founded at Wilson's behest to prevent war in the future. Think of it as a proto-United Nations. And the League of Nations said that, look, places like the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, are not quite ready to rule themselves yet. They need someone to look over them and help them develop to that point. And so they gave European countries like England and France mandates to rule over these areas. Now, it didn't help that now we're in a mechanization age and oil had been discovered in these lands. So mandate might have been a little bit better term than colonization, but that's basically what it was. The Turkish homeland itself barely survived. Required a nationalist government and army to be hastily set up by an Ottoman general named Mustafa Kemal Ataturk to defend itself and survive as a political entity. Ataturk is a formal title of appreciation by the nation. It means father of Turkey, basically. So often in history, periods and figures can get lost in the shuffle, especially if they're surrounded by even larger and more important events. And perhaps there's no better example of this than the Weimar Republic in Germany, which lasted from 1919 to 1933. It's bookended by World War I and at the far end by the rise of the Nazis in World War II. And this lesson's going to examine that curious time in Germany between the two most monumentous wars of the previous century. So let's get a little background here on the early republic. Prior to World War I, Germany had been a relatively democratic federal republic, ruled by a triumvirate of the Kaiser, the Bundesrat, and an imperial diet, which is a legislative body that was elected via universal male suffrage. Unfortunately, defeat in World War I and in 1918 at the terms imposed upon the German Empire by the victorious Allies caused economic hardship in Germany and soon after the collapse of the government. For example, in order to pay the massive debt, the Allies imposed upon the German government, the German government resolved to simply print more money. And this caused rampant hyperinflation, which made the German currency, the Deutschmark, virtually worthless. And horror stories emerged of men and women carrying wheelbarrows full of money to the store to simply buy a loaf of bread. Now, in the midst of the chaos, several factions vied for political power. For example, a strong communist movement named the Spartacists controlled Berlin, forcing the centrist German nationalists to declare the German Republic in Weimar Germany, hence giving the period in the republic its name. The institution of the Weimar Republic in 1919 intended to create the best democracy possible in Germany. It gave both men and women over the age of 20 the right to vote on a president and a representative assembly named the Reichstag. Unfortunately, the nature of the voting system made the Reichstag home to an enormous number of political parties and platforms, and very little could be achieved as a result. Britain has the same problem, but here's how they solved it. Their executive is actually a member of the legislature, which means all these little parties, if they want someone from their party to be elected, have to cooperate and in some ways, compromise with these other little parties. So that kind of brings up, in Germany, there was the legislature, there was the executive, they were elected separately. And so there was no common voice of the people in the legislature because all they were was a bunch of people arguing amongst each other. And so the common voice comes to be the executive in the form of the president. By 1923, Weimar Germany was nearing total collapse as economic problems and rival political guerrilla movements persisted. All the while, Germany's new democracy proved unable to achieve anything of substance. In 1923, however, several events coalesced to give Weimar Germany its most prosperous period. In 1923, the German statesman Gustav Stresemann amalgamated many of the centrist parties within the Reichstag to form the Great Coalition. And though the coalition lasted less than a year, it was able to finally achieve several positive reforms to help the ailing German people and economy, including providing government funds to help the unemployed pay their bills and find new jobs. Unfortunately for Stresemann and Germany, the coalition was short-lived and the Reichstag returned to its prior intransience soon after the coalition collapsed. But while Stresemann could do his best to achieve reform in the Reichstag, there was little he could do about Germany's crippling war debt and the resultant economic problems. And this required outside financial assistance, which Germany found in 1923 through Charles Dawes and the United States. Dawes was director of the United States Bureau of the Budget, and after President Herbert Hoover appointed Dawes to the Allied Reparations Committee, he formulated a plan to help the ailing economy of Germany. And this program, now known as the Dawes Plan, aimed to help boost the German economy. And through his position on the committee, Dawes called for Germany to recall the old Deutschmarks, burn the currency, and essentially start their monetary system from scratch. Now, if there's too much money out there, it's too easy to come by. People won't work unless they get even more. So by taking it all back and burning it, there's no money. Well, now money is rare again, and you might be willing to work for just a little bit. Additionally, he got Allied governments to agree to lend approximately $200 million to the German government and also gave Germany a longer period of time to repay its debt. The plan allowed some breathing room for the German economy, basically, and allowed it to get back on its feet and gave the German government some breathing space when it came to reparation payments. The success of the Dawes Plan, however, was short-lived. It soon became apparent that the German economy depended entirely on infusions of cash from foreign governments. It was not producing anything on its own of value. In 1929, shortly after the death of Stresemann, the Wall Street market collapse caused economic ruin throughout the Western world, but most significantly at the collapse's epicenter, the United States. The US had been Germany's largest loaner in the 1920s, and after the market collapse, the US government and private banks could not afford to lend money to Germany anymore and thus prop up its economy. And with the constant infusions of foreign cash removed, the fragile German economy unraveled. Factories shut down, workers were laid off by the thousands, unemployment soared to over 6 million by January 1933. And indeed, many of the same problems which Weimar Germany had faced in its infancy cropped up again, and Germans threw their support behind rival extremist political factions. In the 1930 election, only a year after the collapse of the stock market, both the Communist and Nazi parties of Germany made significant advances, each picking up over 100 seats in the Reichstag. In 1932, the Nazi Party picked up even more seats and became the largest party in the German Reichstag. And with these successes at the ballot box, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party began to consolidate power over the German government and slowly unravel the democratic practices of the Weimar Republic. The Nazi Party pushed through several decrees which gave both Hitler and the presidency more power over the German government. And in July of 1933, the Weimar Republic was effectively over when the Reichstag declared the Nazi Party as the only legal political party in Germany. And when the German president died the following year, the office was abolished and its powers absorbed by the Chancellor, Adolf Hitler. That's what's going on in Germany. And as you can see, it's pretty rough there. And you can see how it would lead to World War II. But let's go back to Turkey for a little bit, because Turkey is going to have its own set of problems. Its dissolution is going to force it to focus a lot more internally, but leave the Middle East, the rest of the Ottoman Empire, on its own, basically, and look at the problems we have in the Middle East to this day. And a large part of it comes as a result of this. For centuries prior to World War I, the Ottoman Empire had ruled over vast parts of the Middle East, Northern Africa, and even large swaths of the Balkans in Europe. The expansive empire, however, had been slowly declining over the previous few hundred years, losing much of its territory in the Balkans in separate conflicts with Austria, Russia, and other European powers. Economically, it had been slowly weakened by the colonization of North America and the growth of the Atlantic trade routes, as Western Europe no longer relied solely on trade with the Far East through the Mediterranean and Ottoman-controlled waters. As soon as the flagging Ottoman Empire joined World War I on the German side, the Allies began making plans to break up the Ottoman Empire into colonial plots for each of the victorious Allied powers. And powers over the shipping through the Dardanelles was to go to Russia, give them their warm water port, Smyrna on the Mediterranean coast to Greece, who had been owned by the Ottoman Empire but had been fighting for independence for the past 50 years. And the Middle East was to be divvied up between France and Great Britain. The Allies carried out this partitioning through the effective imprisonment of the Ottoman Sultan, who was kept under close guard and forced to agree to the splitting up of the empire. In 1918 and 1919, the various Allied nations took control of their Allied possessions, leaving the former Ottomans in control of only Constantinople and parts of northern Anatolia, the plateau of Turkey there. Now, not all Turks were willing to take the breakup of the Ottoman Empire lightly. Soon after the empire's partitioning, a nationalist movement cropped up. And while these Turkish nationalists were willing to accept the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, they refused to accept the partitioning of the Turkish homeland and called for all Turkish-speaking peoples to rise up in resistance to foreign powers taking control of territory in Asia Minor. And this movement was fostered and led by someone we previously mentioned in this lecture, a former Ottoman official, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Ataturk had fled the Ottoman capital soon after the Allies' occupation, and by 1919, his forces were fighting a guerrilla war against the Greeks, and they soon set up a Turkish nationalist government in Ankara. Full-scale battle between the Turks and Greeks continued throughout 1920 and 1921, with Ataturk winning several victories, forcing the Greeks out of Inner Anatolia. In 1922, Ataturk's troops continued to push back the Greeks, even to the point of capturing Smyrna, the city the Allies had granted the Greeks in the partitioning of the Ottoman Empire, which is on that Anatolian plain in Turkey. Now, the Greeks had colonized Turkey long before the birth of Christ, and there's still lots of Greek-speaking people there. So remember, again, this nationalist desire to unite all people of a common linguistic and historical, that includes Greeks, the way they saw it. So what remained of the Greek forces were forced to evacuate across the sea back to Greece. Now, at this point, the British intervened and proposed a truce to end the fighting, which confirmed the Turkish nationalist government in its gains. Additionally, both the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople and the Ankara-based nationalist government were invited to determine a final solution to the conflict. And the Treaty of Lausanne in July of 1923 confirmed the borders of a Turkish state that largely is the Turkey we know today, with the exception of a few border disputes with Iraq, which were settled by the League of Nations later in the decade. Furthermore, the nationalist government installed by Ataturk at Ankara was recognized as the only legitimate government of the Republic of Turkey, and Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was confirmed as Turkey's first president, thus ending the Sultanate. Now, whereas Turkey was fighting off attempts at colonization by the powerful victors of World War I, Indians in the interwar period had to contend with colonialism that had been established in prior centuries. So let's turn our head to, we're looking at the end of empires here. What about the victorious empire, the British Empire? And that's what we'll have to pick up tomorrow. So do you guys have any questions for today?
I have a question
Yes.
regarding the Russian Revolution. So
Okay.
like they had their revolution, but then after Joseph Stalin was the president, like he was a dictator, right? So that was a step back for them, wasn't it?
Oh, very bad. You got to remember how he came to power too. Lenin had a few good advisors who were close to him, including Stalin. Well, it was unclear who Lenin would name his successor because he suffered from a stroke before he could do it and was an invalid. And so he's still alive. All these advisors are kind of political machinations trying to get people behind him so that they can claim to be the leader when Lenin dies, which was inevitable. It was going to happen because he was so sick. Well, Stalin, and Molotov were the two biggest contenders here. And Stalin just decides, Stalin's a brutal guy, basically. He just decides, you know what? I'm just going to kill my opponents and then I don't have to worry about them. And he kind of afterwards, knowing that that's how he got the power, he became very kind of obsessed with people doing the same thing to him. And so whenever he suspected it, he would just kill them first. If people didn't want to follow his ideas, like large groups of people, he would either kill them or send them to stalags in the Siberia to work. And so, yes, he was very brutal. Millions of Russians died under his rule.
Okay. So, like, how did this happen, like, after they had their revolution?
It's all inherent in that economic system of communism. Communism is the workers' revolt, right? Workers of the world unite is what Karl Marx said. And so the Soviet Union, the idea behind a Soviet is a committee of workers. That's why it's called the Soviet Union. It was supposed to be the workers who ruled everything. But this is the problem with communism. Its ideals, its utopian ideals are really great. Whatever we make will be shared with everybody and everybody will have a share in everything, no matter how good they are or anything. We'll provide everything for everybody and everybody will have a share. But someone still has to coordinate this stuff, right? Someone has to decide, okay, how will it be shared? What are we going to produce? How are we going to do these things? So power is never absent from even this governmental system. And people with power, you can easily become drunk and obsessed with power. And Stalin did. So he was so afraid someone might take his power that he wasn't willing to share it and thus became a dictator. And that's been the historical pattern of every communist nation since. And of course, a true dyed-in-the-wool communist will tell you, well, the problem is we haven't had the right person lead a communist nation yet. And so they're still diehard communists despite all this evidence.
Okay.
Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. Interesting.
What did you think of the German history I went through today?
Well, like the Weimar Republic thing.
Yeah.
Like we talked about that a lot in Germany. And then it's just like very interesting, like how the Nazi party like took over whole Germany, kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's very interesting. And, of course, during World War II, you had a lot of people who, that's just, and World War I, that's Germany. Germans are like that. And I always had a hard time believing that, in part because I am part German. I think it's a desperate people who are just looking for something to hold on to be honest. They were devastated by World War I. And they made a bad choice thinking, because he was a great speaker, let's face it. Adolf Hitler was a very charismatic speaker. And people wanted some hope, and they globbed onto him thinking he would do it. And in the short term, the kind of socialist policies he put in there, like infrastructure, they did revive the German economy somewhat. His ways to get around the Treaty of Versailles, like creating police orders instead of an army, instilled still some military pride in Germany. And so, some patriotism. And he was able to use that to do some things that were evil, basically. And so I think in large part, the German people were fooled by their government.
Yeah, I think like especially,
I'm sorry.
I think especially young people really like believed in him because there was like the Hitler Jugend, which like kind of like summer camps that they could go to, and they would know like
there was hope. There was hope. And who wants,
Yeah.
especially a young person, as someone, let's say I'm late middle age now, someone late middle age, someone older, elderly, they've been there when Germany was at its high point. And they can tell the stories. And when you're a young kid, will that ever happen to me? And someone's telling you, yes, you want to believe them. Okay, how do I get there? How do I get to this high point? And so I really think Hitler just took advantage of that.
Yeah.
That's why I'm kind of glad of the Anglo tradition. I'm not saying England's any better, but there certainly is a tradition in English history of don't trust your government. And I'm proud to be a recipient of that cultural tradition and a follower and adherent of it. I don't trust the government.
So why don't they want the people to trust the government?
Well, look at what Hitler did in Germany is always one of my big things.
Well, yeah, but like, why would England say that to their own people?
Oh, well, no, but we're not, that's just a cultural thing. It actually comes from the people not to trust the government.
Oh, okay.
And we'd have to go back into Western civilization one with the beginning of the Magna Carta. Look at when we talked about the English Civil War. What was it? We can't trust the king. He's Catholic. He'll try to force the Catholicism on us. Same thing with the Glorious Revolution. So all these things kind of together is set up. It wasn't people telling people. It was just kind of a mood. You can't trust the government. The king was the government. You can't trust.
Okay.
And look at the American Revolution is just an extension of that. Look at what the king wants to do to us. Well, he doesn't want to listen to us. And then you go back to, notions of Germanic democracy, which we would have gotten into in Western Civ 1, where even German kings, and I'm not talking about Germanic kings. So the Holy Roman Empire, I'm talking about pre-Christian Germanic kings, were not kings in a sense that they could rule absolutely the way the church had set it up with the Holy Roman Empire. So post-Christianization Germany is a lot different than pre-Christian Germanic nations. And by those, I even mean the Vikings up in Norway and, the Danish and people like that who invade England and bring with them this idea that the king is just a boss and we'll only work for him as long as he can pay us and provide for us. And then maybe we'll listen to him. But if we disagree, we'll fight him. And that's, that tradition is carried then by the Normans in France who invade England and set up their kingdom, and the Danes who invaded the north of England. So there's a tradition in England of, dude, we'll only work for you if you can do good for us. We're not just going to obey you just because you're the king, which I think that the Christianization of Germany and the setup of the Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne affected that cultural tradition there. Otherwise, you guys might have the same beliefs. And who knows, in 200 years, it may revert to that, to where Germany is able to say, listen, we have this great tradition ever since Hitler of not trusting our government. And it may be your claim as well.
Maybe.
Maybe.
Who knows?
But this is what, history and culture do to people. It's why nationalism, in some cases, is not a bad thing. Because it certainly gives you different perspectives where we're all not just unified in lockstep.
Yeah, it gives you a lot of experience.
Yeah.
Makes you think about stuff.
Yeah. All right. Well, did you have any other questions, Leonie?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, hopefully I'll see you tomorrow then.
Yes.
Have a good day.
Bye. You too.